funding, and through JNU Academic, a very crucial, critical space of thinking and discussion is kept alive in our embattled and besieged university. So I want to thank JNU Academic from the bottom of my heart. I want to thank also SAA for providing this space, again in a context where spaces are shrinking. And most of all today I want to thank the panelists who will be to speak on my book. All three of them, Vijayashree, Rahul and Rachna, have shaped my work, and the book has been shaped in very important ways by their work. And in addition, Rachna and Rahul have read chapters and disagreed and so on, and we've had interesting discussions around the comments that they made. So it's very, very meaningful for me that it is the three of them who are going to be speaking about my book and quite possibly tearing it apart, but that would be part of the fun. I'll just take a little time. What I thought I'd do is that I would just give a broad outline of this book, and then each of them would speak about whatever part of the book that they found interesting. We haven't actually discussed in advance what part that they would talk about. So first of all, I want to explain this term misdirection that I have used. And I've used it in a very specific sense. So it's not misdirection in the sense of where is the SAA auditorium when you're directed to SIS. It's not that sort of misdirection. It's a very specific term, and I've explained it in the very first paragraph, the very first sentence of the book. It comes from magic tricks, the performing of magic tricks. And in the performing of magic tricks, misdirection involves drawing attention away from where the trick is happening to another place or to other objects that are made to appear more fascinating. You know, when they say pick a card, any card, and they are subtly directing you towards picking one card rather than another, and so on. Or in big stage performances, there's mirrors and there's smoke and so on. So there's a way of directing your attention away from where the trick is happening to some other object or to some other space which appears more fascinating, and by the time you come out of that, the trick has happened elsewhere. That's how I'm using this direction. So in this book, I address the manner in which the master discourse of secularism and the grid of meanings it produces affects such a misdirection. The field of meaning that secularism invokes structures our vision, making certain objects and features hyper-visible, while obscuring others that are critical factors in contemporary politics and intellectual production. I start the book with two key instances of misleading hypervisibility, something called religion and something called women. Here I explore the intertwined issues around religion, state, women and secularism. On the one hand, there is the assumption in debates around secularism in the 20th and early 21st centuries that a specific field exists, separate from politics and the state, recognizable as religion, self-evident, and that modern politics is manifested in establishing a wall between the two. This is the one assumption that has circulated in debates around on secularism. On the other hand, there is the assumption that religion is made visible primarily on the bodies of women, and that the process of defining religion and religious freedom is to be conducted through indicating specific ways in which women's social status and roles indicate modernity, tradition, democracy, and secularism, or whatever value is at stake in a particular controversy. It's through women's bodies that a society will be defined as modern or not modern, or democratic or not democratic. We have long histories of this, Satan, or the veil, or these kinds of the ways in which through playing on the woman's body, certain values are highlighted. Both these assumptions are sought to be unpacked in my book. That is, the two assumptions being one, that religion can be manifested or understood through the bodies of women, and the other that there's a specific field called religion that you can set, that already exists, self-evident, you don't have to define it. These two are what I try to unpack in the book. I do focus on India, hoping to draw out implications for wider contexts. Next, I discuss religion and how it is produced under specific circumstances by examining ascendant Hindu supremacism as now a state project in India. This book tries to understand the ways in which the construction of religion functions under conditions of majoritarianism. In addition, three key elements in the co-construction of religion and the state are considered. I use this term to suggest that the state and religion are co-constructed. It's not that the state acts upon a separate field called religion. And I look at three specific elements in this practice in India: the essential religious practices test, the idea of religious institutions or deities as juristic persons, and the state's role in managing the finances of religious institutions. So that's the hyper-visibility of religion and women in the discourse of secularism, which I hope to unpack and so on in the first chapters. If religion and women are hyper-visibilized by the discourse of secularism, other features and objects are rendered invisible. Chapter 3 focuses on one such feature, caste, as it operates in a particular space. Caste, one of the critical elements in this region, as in this region of the subcontinent, caste is obscured by the celebration and practice of secularism. I examined the millennia-old project of Brahmanism in this territory now called India, of producing a community that abides by the caste system, accepts Brahmanism as the dominant ideology, and the idea is, and I argue that Brahmanism has tried to produce such a community called Hindu. So this chapter is actually called The Failed Project of Creating Hindus. Starting from roughly the Puranas, composed around the 4th to 11th centuries, continuing into the 20th century ideologues of Hindutva such as V.D. Savarkar, and further into the Hindutva of the 21st century. The rich heterogeneity of beliefs and practices across the subcontinent, those which cannot be classified as Muslim, Christian, Jewish or Parsi, have been sought to be assimilated into Brahmanism or marginalized or wiped out. This diversity of practices gets labeled as Hindu only because the legal definition of Hindus is one that gathers up all those who are not Muslim, Christian, Parsi or Jewish into its fold. Thus, what is often celebrated as the rich diversity, inclusivity and tolerance of Hinduism is merely the massive and age-old assimilationist project of Brahmanism, which has still not succeeded in making Hindus in quotation marks. The grid of secularism that focuses on something called religious identity enables the elision of caste, and via the elision, the legal and social normalizing of the label Hinduism. This label enables Hindutva politics to claim Hindus as the majority in India, which is the basis of Hindu nationalist and Hindu supremacist politics. We need to recognize that India is a collection of minorities, not a Hindu majority country. And this book argues that the modern project of Hindutva is only the current phase of a process that began with the advent of Vedic people into this landmass. Of course, the rise and growth of an ideology called Hindutva in the last 100 years is a new development in the history of Brahmanism, and this project has been extensively studied, but in isolation from an older history. So here I focus on Hindutva's continuity with the millennia-old project rather than the breaks. Rejecting the claim of Hindutva that Hindus are the majority requires mainstream left secular and feminist politics to reorient itself to a serious engagement with Dalit Bahujan scholarship and life forms. Another element obscured by the grid, so one is caste, another element obscured by the grid of secularism is the non-secular self in the global south, non-individuated, non-rational, and drawing on multiple spiritual sources for its sustenance. In discussing this, we go on a journey tracking the modern secular discipline of psychoanalysis in various parts of the global south, and the manner in which it is reshaped here from the lifetime of Freud onwards. Through a study of how psychoanalysis was interpreted and how it traveled in the global south, we will find that in comparison to all the other forms of modern post-enlightenment knowledge that entered the global south, all our disciplines, history, economics, political science, psychoanalysis was most committed to drawing on specific locations in the project of understanding the self. That is to say, these other disciplines tended to translate the global south into the terms already set by the disciplines as they have emerged in Anglo-America. But psychoanalysis, for an interesting set of reasons, offered fundamental challenges to Freud even in his own lifetime, rejecting any idea of a decontextualized human and often transforming the practice beyond recognition from its incarnation in the land of its birth. The final element obscured by secular discourse that this book considers is capitalism. The invocation of secularism enables an uncritical acceptance of the violence of capitalism on people and nature as the historically inescapable way into modernity, where religious sectarianism is supposed to no longer hold sway. Disenchanted now, land, forests, rivers, and all of nature are available to be commoditized. This is the journey from the darkness of pagan beliefs and religious sectarianism into the light of secular modernity. Thus, the project of secular modernity emerged alongside capitalist transformation in the West, and in post-independence India too is intimately tied to a notion of development which, as we know, is predicated on the large-scale sacrifice of the interests of specific communities in order to serve the greater interest of the Indian citizen. Since much of the resistance to capitalist transformation across the globe is conducted by indigenous peoples whose lands are rich in minerals, their resistance is often conducted in terms that sacralize nature and draw on indigenous spiritualities. Secular environmentalism is often unable to relate to this mode of resistance to capital. On the other hand, in India, the political doctrine of Hindutva has a dual relationship to capitalism. When capitalist development counters Brahminical Hinduism, Hindutva stands opposed to it. But the Hindutva-driven state supports capitalism against indigenous and other spiritualities. And the support for capitalism comes from non-Hindutva, non-majoritarian, perfectly secular states as well. So you can think of Setu Samudram project, you can think of Pathargadi, you can think of Niyamgiri Hills, and of course the long old tragedy of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. So secularism secularism is completely capable of supporting and promoting capitalism. In fact, that is part of its work. The argument of this book, at the end of all this, is not that secularism should be abandoned, but that what we are calling secularism is not itself a positive value, nor is its meaning self-evident. Secularism can serve majoritarian and minority politics. We saw this in Karnataka. We saw the way the BJP used very secular arguments about uniforms to try and stop students from wearing the hijab. So it can serve in France. There's another very good example. So secularism can serve majoritarian anti-minority politics and capitalist transformation. But it can equally be invoked to sustain democratic politics that respects heterogeneity, social justice, and ecological concerns. If you look at, for example, what I'm saying is that in India there have been two kinds of meanings of secularism, but the Sarva Dharma Samabhav understanding is, I think, one that from the perspective of this book is a very productive understanding of secularism, and we see a kind of a reassertion and a reproduction of this meaning in militant struggles like the Indian Farmers movement of 2020-21. So that movement's central concerns were capitalist transformation of the agrarian sector and climate change, but as we know, the questions of caste, gender, and minority rights were very much in the foreground. We will see how anti-capitalist politics globally inhabits very heterogeneous spaces. So the last two chapters look at ways in which constitutionalism acquires a new life and what an anti-capitalist politics looks like beyond the capitalist horizon globally. So we will see how anti-capitalist politics globally inhabits very heterogeneous spaces, facing up to internal dissent and differences that erupt within. These movements coalesce around different kinds of values that are locally produced and inflected, but which are at the same time in some sort of conversation with one another across the globe. If secularism is invoked at all in these movements, it is never in the sense of separation of state and religion, but in a more people-oriented understanding of how to live with difference. The overriding value that is asserted in these movements, whether it's constitutionalism or anti-capitalism, appears to be democracy, with all its faults. But democracy, too, is reimagined in more direct terms, distanced in particular from political parties, which have over the 20th century appropriated and ventriloquized the people. And we are living at a moment today when the almost complete break between people and states is so evident across the globe in support for Palestine. You can see the complete break between what governments are doing and what people are demanding. So there's a way in which political parties and representative democracy has ventriloquized and appropriated the people, but it appears that democracy is gradually being reimagined in more direct terms. Is it possible to think of democracy radically differently in the 21st century, post-COVID 21st century in particular? What role does secularism have to play in it, if any? And as you can see, I'm not finding the term very useful beyond the point. I consider these questions and their implications in this book. I will now ask Rahul Govind to offer us